May 1st, 1945. Deep beneath the ruins of Berlin, a mother dressed her 6 children in white nightgowns. She combed their hair, tied ribbons into neat bows, and told them everything would be fine. What happened next in that underground bunker would shock even hardened Soviet soldiers who discovered the scene 2 days later. The children, aged 4 to 12, lay dead in their beds. Their mother had ended their lives with her own hands. This was Magda Goebbels, wife of Hitler's propaganda minister, and the unofficial First Lady of the Third Reich. But her story was just one among many. The women who stood beside Nazi Germany's most powerful men faced fates that ranged from imprisonment to poverty, from public scorn to lifelong defiance. Some paid dearly for their husbands' crimes. Others escaped with barely a scratch, and a few refused to renounce the ideology that had destroyed their world. This is what happened when the Third Reich fell and these women were left to face the consequences. Emmy Goering had once been the most glamorous woman in Nazi Germany. A successful actress before her marriage, she became the wife of Hermann Goering, commander of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor. Their 1935 wedding was a spectacle of Nazi power. The streets of Berlin were decorated for the occasion. Traffic stopped throughout the inner city, and more than 200 Luftwaffe planes circled overhead. Adolf Hitler served as best man. Emmy was 42 years old, marrying one of the most powerful men in Europe. For the next decade, Emmy lived a life of unimaginable luxury. Goering named his massive country estate Karenhall after his first wife, who had died in 1931, but he referred to his hunting lodge as Emmy Hall. The Goering residence became known for extravagant parties where Emmy played hostess to Nazi Germany's elite. She wore gowns that required multiple closets. She draped herself in jewelry acquired through means that would later be questioned. She claimed the title of First Lady of the Third Reich, a position that created bitter rivalry with another woman who had similar aspirations. In 1938, at age 45, Emmy gave birth to a daughter. The event was celebrated as a national triumph. Goering had been wounded in the groin during the failed beer hall putsch of 1923, leading to speculation about his fertility. When Emmy became pregnant, rumors circulated about artificial insemination. The birth of Etta Goering on June 2, 1938, brought jubilation to the Reich. Goering ordered 500 planes to fly over Berlin in celebration. He stated he would have ordered 1,000 if the baby had been a boy. Adolf Hitler became Etta's godfather. Emmy's role as Hitler's hostess at state functions positioned her as the unofficial First Lady, but this created problems. Hitler's longtime companion, Eva Braun, despised Emmy for assuming a role that Eva felt should have been hers. Emmy openly snubbed Eva, treating her with contempt. The animosity became so severe that Hitler issued angry instructions to Goering, demanding that Emmy treat Eva with more respect. As punishment for her condescending attitude, Emmy was no longer invited to the Berghof, Hitler's Bavarian mountain retreat. Emmy also competed with Magda Goebbels for the First Lady title. Both women hosted lavish parties. Both dressed like royalty. Both sought to outshine the other in loyalty to the Führer. The rivalry between them was intense and never fully resolved. Emmy had Hitler's ear through her husband's position, but Magda had something Emmy lacked: Hitler's genuine personal affection and trust. As the war turned against Germany, Emmy's world began to crumble. The luxury, the parties, the privileged position, all of it depended on Nazi victory. When defeat came in May 1945, Emmy's fate changed overnight. American forces arrested her at her home in Sackdilling on May 21, 1945, just days before Etta's 7th birthday. Emmy and her daughter, along with her sister, niece, and a servant, were taken to Straubing Camp, 140 kilometers from Nuremberg. The conditions at the camp were a shocking contrast to the life Emmy had known. The woman who had once hosted state dinners and worn designer gowns now lived in basic accommodations with minimal amenities. She was held there while her husband faced trial at Nuremberg. Emmy could only communicate with Goering through letters. She watched from a distance as he was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, sentenced to death by hanging. On October 15, 1946, the night before his scheduled execution, Hermann Goering took his own life. He managed to obtain a cyanide capsule and ended his life in his cell, denying the Allies the satisfaction of hanging him. For Emmy, this meant she was now a widow, left to face judgment on her own. A German denazification court convicted Emmy of being a Nazi. The sentence was 1 year in jail. Beyond the imprisonment, 30% of her property was confiscated. When she was released, she faced additional penalties: a 5-year ban from working as an actress, the career she had abandoned when she married Göring. At age 55, trying to revive a theatrical career after a decade away, and now bearing the stigma of being Göring's widow, Emmy found herself unemployable. The woman who had lived in palaces, who had worn gowns requiring entire rooms for storage, who had entertained Nazi Germany's leadership, now owned 2 dresses. By the time of Göring's death, she and Etta had been reduced to living in a 2-room cottage with no running water or electricity. The contrast could not have been starker. Emmy eventually secured a very small apartment in Munich. She lived there in relative poverty for the rest of her life. In her final years, she suffered from sciatica, a painful condition affecting the nerves in her legs and back. She survived by writing. In 1967, she published an autobiography titled An der Seite meines Mannes, At My Husband's Side, which was translated into English in 1972 as My Life with Göring. The book was Emmy's attempt to shape the historical narrative, to present her version of events, and perhaps to defend her husband's memory. But it did little to change public perception or improve her circumstances. Emmy Göring died in Munich on June 8, 1973, at the age of 80. She had spent nearly 3 decades living in obscurity, a forgotten figure from a regime that Germany was desperate to forget. Her daughter Etta fared somewhat better, but carried the burden of her name throughout her life. Etta never married, devoted herself to caring for her mother, and later became involved in far-right political circles. She remained proudly defiant about her father's legacy, speaking highly of Hermann Göring in interviews and defending him against accusations of war crimes. When Etta died in 2018 at age 80, she was buried in secret to prevent her grave from becoming a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis. But while Emmy Göring's fate involved imprisonment, poverty, and social exile, it paled in comparison to the horror that befell another of the Third Reich's prominent wives. Magda Goebbels represented everything the Nazi regime claimed to value in women: beautiful, devoted to the Führer, mother of 6 children. She embodied the idealized image of German womanhood that propaganda endlessly promoted. Behind the carefully constructed facade, however, lay a much darker reality. And in the final days of the Third Reich, she would commit an act so horrifying that it would haunt historical memory for generations. Magda was born in 1901 to an unwed couple, Augusta Behrendt and engineer Oskar Ritschl. Her parents married later that year but divorced when she was still very young. Her mother then married a Jewish man, Richard Friedlander, who would perish in a concentration camp during the Holocaust. Magda's early life was marked by this complex background that would later be carefully hidden by Nazi propagandists. She first married industrialist Günther Quandt, one of Germany's wealthiest men and founder of companies that would eventually include BMW. From this marriage, she had a son, Harold, born in 1921. The marriage was unhappy, and Magda divorced Quandt in 1929. Through social connections, she became involved with the Nazi Party and eventually met Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister. Their marriage in 1931 was blessed by Hitler himself, who saw propaganda value in the union. Magda and Joseph went on to have 6 children: Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun. All their names began with H, which many interpreted as honoring Hitler, though Magda's mother claimed it was simply a family hobby to find names with that letter. True or not, the symbolism was clear to the German public. Magda became the perfect Nazi wife in public, while enduring a troubled marriage in private. Joseph Goebbels was notorious for his numerous affairs. His womanizing was so egregious that at one point Magda asked Hitler to grant her a divorce. Hitler refused. He needed the image of the perfect Nazi family that Magda and Joseph projected. So Magda stayed, raising her children and fulfilling her role as mother of the master race. Hitler had genuine affection for Magda. Unlike his relationship with Emmy Göring, which was more formal and political, Hitler felt comfortable with Magda. He spent more time with her than she spent with her own husband. After Rudolf Hess flew to Scotland in 1941 in what looked like betrayal, Hitler made a point of continuing to support Hess's wife Ilsa, but his care for Magda was even more personal. She became his confidant, perhaps the closest thing Hitler had to a female friend. As Germany's defeat became inevitable in early 1945, Magda faced a choice. Many offered to help her and the children escape Berlin. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister, specifically offered to smuggle the children out of the city. They could have been taken to safety, spared from the final collapse. Magda refused every offer. She insisted that the family must stay at her husband's side. More chillingly, she insisted the children must stay with her. On April 22, 1945, the Goebbels family moved into the Führerbunker complex beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden in central Berlin. The children, 12-year-old Helga, 11-year-old Hildegard, 9-year-old Helmut, 8-year-old Holdine, 6-year-old Hedwig, and 4-year-old Heidrun, found themselves in a cold, gray concrete world far removed from their previous comfortable life. They slept in a single room, reported to have either 2 or 3 sets of bunk beds, depending on which witness account one believes. The children tried to maintain some normalcy. They played with Hitler's dog Blondie. They sang together, performing for Hitler and other bunker occupants. Hitler's secretary, Traudl Junge, remembered being with the children on the afternoon of April 30th, when they heard the gunshot that ended Hitler's life. The sound marked the beginning of the end for the Goebbels children as well. Magda had been planning their deaths for at least a month. She had consulted with SS doctors Ludwig Stumpfeger and Helmut Kuntz about how to end the children's lives quickly and, in her words, painlessly. She told Junge that she would rather have her children die than live in disgrace after Germany's defeat. She claimed they had no future in a post-Nazi Germany, that they would be mocked and jeered at, that a merciful God would understand her decision. On the evening of May 1st, 1945, Magda put her plan into action. She called for Dr. Kuntz and told him the decision had been made. Joseph Goebbels thanked him for helping his wife put the children to sleep. Magda first administered morphine to make the children drowsy. Around 8:40 p.m., she helped them change into their white nightgowns. She combed their hair and tied ribbons in the girls' hair. One witness, Rokas Misch, a guard in the bunker, later recalled seeing the children being led upstairs. 4-year-old Heidrun, who had a sore throat and wore a scarf around her neck, turned back to look at him. Giggling, she said, "Misch, Misch, du bist ein Fisch. Misch, Misch, you are a fish," teasing him one last time before her mother led her and her siblings upstairs. Misch later said he suspected what was about to happen and would always regret not intervening. The eldest child, 12-year-old Helga, may have suspected something was wrong. Misch reported that she had grown very sullen in the final days, sometimes crying softly. As the brightest of the children, she likely understood that the adults were lying about the war's progress. The post-mortem examination of Helga's body would reveal significant bruising across her face, suggesting she struggled against what was happening to her. When the children were drowsy from the morphine, Magda crushed glass cyanide capsules in their mouths. One by one, all 6 children were poisoned. Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun died in their bunks, dressed in white nightgowns with ribbons in their hair. The murder took only minutes. After the children were dead, Magda and Joseph Goebbels walked up to the garden of the Chancellery. There, they ended their own lives. The exact method is disputed. Some accounts say they bit on cyanide capsules and were then shot by Goebbels' adjutant Günther Schwegermann. Others say Schwegermann heard gunshots and found them already dead. Their bodies were doused with petrol but only partially burned. On May 2nd, 1945, Soviet troops discovered the charred remains of Joseph and Magda Goebbels in the Chancellery Garden. The following day, they found the 6 children in the bunker below, still in their night clothes, still with ribbons in their hair, lying peacefully in their bunks as though merely sleeping. The photographs and reports from that discovery shocked the world. The murder of the Goebbels children remains one of the most disturbing acts of the Nazi regime's final days. Magda Goebbels had been so thoroughly indoctrinated, so completely devoted to Hitler and Nazi ideology, that she chose death for her children, rather than allow them to live in a world without National Socialism. She saw no future worth having for them, no possibility of redemption or rebuilding. Better they die as Nazis than live as defeated Germans. The only Goebbels child who survived was Harald Quandt, Magda's son from her first marriage. He was 23 years old and serving as a Luftwaffe lieutenant when his half-siblings were murdered. A prisoner of war at the time, he was spared their fate purely by geographic chance. He survived the war, and along with his half-brother Herbert Quandt, went on to run his father's businesses, including BMW. Harold died in a plane crash in 1967 at age 45. Magda Goebbels left behind a final letter to Harold. In it, she wrote about loyalty. Loyalty to the Führer, loyalty to the cause, loyalty even unto death. She asked Harold to be proud of her and to keep her in dear memory. Whether he honored that request or spent his life trying to forget the mother who murdered her other children, we cannot know. But the horror of what Magda did in that bunker ensured she would never be forgotten, no matter how much Germany wanted to move past its Nazi history. While Emmy Goering descended into poverty and Magda Goebbels chose death, another Nazi wife took a different path. Ilsa Hess, wife of Rudolf Hess, became something far more troubling. A lifelong defender of the Nazi ideology who refused to renounce the regime even decades after its collapse. Ilsa Pröll came from a conservative, nationalist family. Born in 1900, she was one of 3 daughters of a wealthy physician who was killed during World War I. Her mother remarried, and Ilsa grew up in comfortable circumstances with access to culture and education. She was among the first women to study at the University of Munich, where she met Rudolf Hess in April 1920. From the beginning, Ilsa felt drawn to Hess. He was an unusual figure, a strange-looking man with deep-set eyes, a gaunt face, heavy eyebrows, and a personality that others found off-putting. He rarely drank, seldom laughed, and obsessed over politics and Adolf Hitler. But Ilsa saw something in him that others missed. She fell in love quickly and completely. Hess, however, was more interested in Hitler than in romance. He joined the Nazi Party in 1920 as member number 16, becoming one of Hitler's earliest and most devoted followers. When Ilsa tried to pursue a relationship, Hess remained distant, more committed to the Nazi cause than to personal attachments. Frustrated, Ilsa threatened to leave for Italy permanently. Hess was unmoved until Adolf Hitler intervened. Hitler, recognizing that Hess needed to settle down, essentially ordered him to marry Ilsa. In a gesture that became legendary within Nazi circles, Hitler took Hess's hand, placed it in Ilsa's hand, and told them to marry. On December 20th, 1927, they wed in Munich with Hitler serving as a witness. For Ilsa, it was a dream come true, though the reality would prove more complicated. Ilsa joined the Nazi Party herself in 1925, receiving member number 25,071. Because the party initially didn't admit women in large numbers, her later membership number belied her early commitment to the cause. She became one of Hitler's inner circle, trusted with sensitive tasks, and included in private gatherings. She even helped care for Gaily Raubal, Hitler's niece, for whom Hitler had inappropriate feelings. When Gaily wanted to become engaged to Hitler's driver Emil Maurice, Ilsa intervened to prevent it, and Maurice was expelled from the inner circle. Ilsa and Rudolf's marriage was strange by conventional standards, but worked according to their shared devotion to Hitler. Rudolf spent more time with Hitler than with his wife, yet Ilsa accepted this arrangement. She was proud to be married to one of Hitler's most loyal followers. In November 1937, they had a son, Wolf Rüdiger Hess. Adolf Hitler became the boy's godfather, continuing the pattern of Hitler's deep involvement in the Hess family. Then came the event that would define the rest of Ilsa's life. On May 10th, 1941, Rudolf Hess flew a solo mission to Scotland. He parachuted into Scottish farmland near the estate of the Duke of Hamilton, believing he could broker a peace deal between Britain and Germany. The mission was a complete disaster. The British treated him as a deranged prisoner. Hitler denounced him as a traitor, and Hess spent the rest of World War II in British captivity. For Ilsa, her husband's flight was devastating, but not shameful. She insisted it had been undertaken with good intentions, an attempt to help Hitler by ending the war with Britain so Germany could focus on fighting the Soviet Union. Despite being mocked and ostracized by other Nazi wives and officials, Ilsa maintained her belief in her husband's noble purpose. Hitler, surprisingly, did not completely abandon Ilsa. He ensured she received a monthly payment of 1,000 marks, so she and her son could survive. The allowance came not from official Nazi party channels but secretly from Eva Braun, Hitler's mistress. This arrangement allowed Ilsa to live through the war years, though she faced constant social isolation and scrutiny. After Germany's defeat, Ilsa's troubles intensified. On June 3, 1947, she was arrested along with other wives of convicted war criminals. She was held in an internment camp in Augsburg-Göggingen for nearly a year. At 47 years old, She was the oldest of the prominent party members imprisoned there. On March 24, 1948, she was released without charges. She settled in the Alpine region of Allgäu, where she opened a pension in 1955 to support herself and her son. Rudolf Hess was convicted at the Nuremberg trials and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was transferred to Spandau prison in Berlin, where he would remain for the next 4 decades. Initially, he was one of 7 Nazi leaders imprisoned there. As the others died or were released, Hess became Spandau's sole occupant, the most expensive prisoner in the world, guarded by rotating forces from Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union. For the first 28 years of his imprisonment, Hess forbade his family from visiting. Ilsa could only communicate with her husband through heavily censored letters. It wasn't until December 1969, when Hess was hospitalized for a perforated ulcer, that he finally allowed his wife and son to visit. By then, Wolf Rüdiger was 32 years old, and Ilsa was 69. They had not seen Rudolf in person since his flight to Scotland in 1941. The reunion was bittersweet. Hess was a broken man, paranoid, claiming his food was poisoned, suffering from mental and physical ailments, but Ilsa remained devoted. She visited him regularly for the remaining 18 years of his life, maintaining her loyalty despite everything. What made Ilsa's story particularly disturbing was not just her devotion to her husband, but her unwavering commitment to Nazi ideology. She never renounced National Socialism. In 1952, she published a book titled England, Nürnberg, Spandau, ein Schicksal in Briefen. England, Nuremberg, Spandau, ein Schicksal in Briefen. A Fate in Letters, which was published by Druffel Verlag, a far-right publishing house. The book consisted of letters between her and Rudolf, presenting their perspective on his mission and imprisonment. Ilsa maintained correspondence with other unrepentant Nazis, including Winifred Wagner, the daughter-in-law of composer Richard Wagner, who also continued to admire Hitler. Ilsa became involved with Stille Hilfe, an organization that aided former SS members and other Nazi war criminals. She attended far-right political gatherings and became a symbolic figure for neo-Nazi movements. On August 17, 1987, Rudolf Hess was found dead in Spandau prison. The official ruling was that the 93-year-old had strangled himself with an electrical cord in a garden shelter. The circumstances raised immediate questions. How could such a frail, nearly blind man have managed to hang himself? His son, Wolf Rüdiger, and his lawyer, Alfred Seidel, argued it was physically impossible, suggesting he had been murdered. But investigations concluded it was indeed self-inflicted. Ilsa was 87 years old when her husband finally died. She had waited 46 years for him to be released. Instead, he died a prisoner. Spandau prison was demolished shortly after to prevent it from becoming a neo-Nazi shrine. Ilsa lived 8 more years, dying on September 7, 1995, at age 95. She had outlived the Third Reich by half a century, but never abandoned its ideology. Her legacy is one of the most troubling among Nazi wives. Emmy Goering paid a price for her husband's crimes and spent her final decades in poverty. Magda Goebbels chose a horrific death for herself and her children, rather than face defeat. But Ilsa Hess lived a long life, maintaining her Nazi convictions, supporting far-right causes, and never expressing regret for the regime that had caused so much suffering. She died believing her husband had been a misunderstood hero, and that National Socialism had been a noble cause betrayed by circumstance and enemies. The fates of these 3 women, Emmy Goering, Magda Goebbels, and Ilsa Hess, reveal the varied consequences faced by Nazi leaders' wives. There was no single pattern, no uniform punishment or redemption. Each woman's story unfolded according to her own choices, her husband's specific role, and the particular circumstances of the war's end. Emmy faced imprisonment, property confiscation, and decades of poverty. Her punishment came through the denazification courts, which convicted her of being a Nazi and stripped her of the wealth she had accumulated during the Third Reich. She lost everything except her daughter and her memories. She spent her final years in obscurity, a reminder that even those who lived in luxury during the Nazi era could fall hard when it ended. Magda never faced earthly judgment because she chose death over accountability. Her decision to murder her children ensured her name would be remembered with horror. She couldn't bear the thought of her children living in a world without Hitler, couldn't imagine a future where being a Goebbels didn't mean power and prestige. Her fanaticism was so complete that she saw death as preferable to defeat. Ilsa survived with her ideology intact, unlike Emmy, who lost her wealth and status, or Magda, who chose self-destruction. Ilsa adapted to the post-war world while maintaining her Nazi convictions. She was imprisoned briefly, but released without trial. She supported herself modestly, raised her son, and spent decades as a visible presence in far-right political circles. She never apologized, never recanted, never acknowledged that the regime she supported had been fundamentally evil. Other Nazi wives faced different outcomes. Gerda Bormann, wife of Hitler's private secretary Martin Bormann, fled with her 10 children as the Reich collapsed. She was found suffering from mercury poisoning and died in 1946 at age 36, leaving her children orphaned. Anneliese von Ribbentrop, wife of Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, escaped punishment entirely and retained her massive fortune as a member of the wealthy Henkel industrial family. Some wives had been victims themselves. The second wife of Robert Ley, head of the German Labor Front, was an outspoken anti-fascist who left him in 1938, taking her children with her. She recognized the evil of the regime and chose conscience over marriage. Others remained loyal to the end, visiting their convicted husbands in prison, defending their legacies, and raising their children to honor their father's memories. The children of these marriages faced their own struggles. Etta Goering lived her entire life as Hermann Goering's daughter, proudly defending him and becoming involved in neo-Nazi circles. The Goebbels children had no choice in their fate. Harold Quandt survived to run his father's business empire, but carried the knowledge that his mother had murdered his half-siblings. Wolf Rudiger Hess grew up with a father he barely knew, imprisoned for a mission that accomplished nothing. The women themselves ranged from the relatively innocent to the deeply complicit. Emmy Goering claimed to be apolitical, interested only in her acting career and her life with Hermann. Whether this was true or convenient revisionism is impossible to know. Magda Goebbels was unquestionably committed to Nazism, serving as a key propaganda figure and true believer in Hitler's vision. Ilsa Hess joined the Nazi Party early, supported it throughout, and never wavered in her loyalty. What unites their stories is the question of responsibility. Were these women victims or perpetrators, passive participants or active collaborators? The answer is not simple. They benefited enormously from the Nazi regime while it lasted. They enjoyed wealth, status, and power that came directly from their husbands' positions in a criminal government. They raised their children in luxury purchased with stolen property and funded by a war of aggression. Yet they were also products of their time, shaped by a society that limited women's roles and demanded obedience to male authority. The ideology they supported, or claimed not to fully understand, taught that women's primary purpose was supporting their husbands and raising Aryan children. They were simultaneously privileged and constrained, powerful and powerless. The denazification process tried to sort the truly guilty from the merely complicit, but the results were inconsistent. Emmy Goering was convicted and imprisoned, despite claiming political ignorance. Anneliese von Ribbentrop escaped punishment despite her husband's central role in Nazi diplomacy. The difference seemed to have less to do with actual guilt than with wealth, family connections, and luck. For historians and ethicists, these women's stories pose difficult questions. Should they have known what their husbands were doing? Probably. Could they have stopped it? Almost certainly not. Were they responsible for enjoying the benefits of crimes they didn't personally commit? The law said yes, at least in some cases, but the punishments were mild compared to what their husbands faced. The women who survived the longest, like Ilsa Hess, who lived to 95, and Emmy Goering, who lived to 80, spent decades processing what had happened. Some, like Emmy, lived quietly, trying to fade from public memory. Others, like Ilsa, remained defiant, refusing to accept that the cause they had supported was fundamentally wrong. Their final years were shaped by choices made decades earlier, decisions that seemed reasonable or even noble at the time, but led to catastrophe. Today, the wives of Nazi leaders occupy an uncomfortable space in historical memory. They are not forgotten, but they are not remembered in the same way as their husbands. Hermann Goering, Joseph Goebbels, and Rudolf Hess are studied in detail, their crimes cataloged, their psychology analyzed, their roles in the Holocaust documented. Their wives appear in footnotes, mentioned briefly as context for understanding the men. Yet their stories reveal important truths about the Nazi regime. They show how ordinary people became complicit in extraordinary evil. They demonstrate how ideology can override maternal instinct, leading a mother to murder her own children. They illustrate how privilege can insulate people from recognizing their role in a criminal system. They prove that some people, when forced to choose between admitting they were wrong and maintaining their beliefs, will choose the beliefs regardless of evidence. The Goebbels children's deaths remain especially haunting. 6 young lives ended not by Allied bombs or Soviet soldiers, but by their own mother's hand. Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun had no say in their fate. They were victims of their mother's fanaticism, sacrificed to an ideology that valued death over defeat. Their small bodies, found in the bunker with ribbons still in their hair, became symbols of how thoroughly the Nazi regime poisoned even the most basic human relationships. Emmy Goring's decline from First Lady to pauper serves as a reminder that Nazi wealth was built on stolen property, and that justice, however delayed and imperfect, did eventually come. Her final years in a small Munich apartment, surviving on book royalties and suffering from chronic pain, represented a form of accountability, even if it fell short of what many felt she deserved. Ilsa Hess's refusal to renounce Nazism demonstrates that ideology can survive even the total defeat of the system it supported. She remained a Nazi until her death in 1995, long after everyone who remembered the Third Reich firsthand was dead or dying. Her commitment to a cause that had caused so much suffering, maintained across 7 decades, challenges the assumption that exposure to truth inevitably changes minds. The contrast between these women's fates also reveals the arbitrariness of post-war justice. Why was Emmy imprisoned while Anneliese von Ribbentrop walked free? Why was Ilsa Hess held for less than a year, while others served longer sentences for lesser connections to the regime? The answers involved wealth, connections, timing, and luck as much as actual culpability. Modern Germany has tried to learn from this history. The graves of Nazi leaders' families are sometimes removed or relocated to prevent them from becoming pilgrimage sites for neo-Nazis. When Etta Goering died in 2018, she was buried in secret. Rudolf Hess's grave was destroyed in 2011 to stop neo-Nazis from gathering there. The message is clear: these people will not be honored. Their ideology will not be celebrated. Their memory will not be preserved as anything but a warning. Yet the questions their lives raise remain relevant. How do we judge those who benefit from evil without directly committing it? What responsibility do spouses bear for their partner's crimes? How do we balance accountability with the recognition that women in that era had limited agency? These are not abstract historical questions. They apply to every authoritarian regime, every criminal organization, every system that elevates some people by oppressing others. The wives of Nazi leaders made choices. Some chose luxury over morality. Some chose loyalty over conscience. Some chose death over accountability. And some, like Ilsa Hess, chose lifelong defiance over admission of error. These choices had consequences, though not always the consequences we might consider just or proportionate. Their children and grandchildren continue to grapple with this legacy. Some, like Harold Quandt, built successful lives while carrying the knowledge of their family's crimes. Others, like Etta Goering, defended their fathers and became involved in far-right movements. Still others disappeared into anonymity, changing their names and trying to escape their inheritance. The history of these women is uncomfortable because it resists simple narratives. They were not innocent victims, but neither were they the primary architects of Nazi crimes. They enjoyed privileges built on suffering, yet they also suffered consequences for their associations. They made choices within constraints, yet those choices had real moral weight. They were human beings capable of love and devotion, yet that love and devotion was often directed toward truly evil men and causes. In the end, the brutal fates of Nazi leaders' wives reflect the broader brutality of the regime they supported. Whether they faced poverty like Emmy Goering, chose horror like Magda Goebbels, or maintained defiance like Ilsa Hess, they all paid a price for their connection to one of history's most criminal governments. The price varied, the justice was imperfect, and the lessons remain contested. But their stories endure as reminders of how ideology can corrupt, how privilege can blind, and how the consequences of evil choices can echo across generations. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel. so you never miss out on more history documentaries.